I want to try something a little bit different this morning, and I need at least 4 quite brave people to read something from the Bible. I try and guarantee that there's not too big a word in your passage, so you should be able to pronounce it. So let me give you the passages, and you might feel like I'll just go to one of these and I'll be happy to read it. They're not very long. They're only like a couple of verses each. In fact, most of them are just one verse. So the first one is from Malachi. So that's quite a challenging one, isn't it? Where's Malachi? So that's in the Old Testament towards the back. Chapter 6 and verse 8. That's one of the verses. And then in the New Testament, Colossians chapter 3. Really? Perhaps it's Micah then. Somebody have a check at Micah. See, at least you're engaged. I did that. That was no. Is it Micah? Micah 6:8. Try that one. Is Micah got 6 chapters? Oh, good. 6:8. Micah. Okay, who's got Micah 6:8? Who'd like to read it? Oh, Janine. Hold on, I'm going to give you a microphone. Okay. I'm going to stand next to you. Read it out quite loud.
And I haven't just done that, but I've got that.
Got it highlighted?
Got it highlighted already.
Oh, good job you remember. Read it out
Thank
to
you.
us.
He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Very good. So Micah 6:8. Okay, let's see if this one's the right one. Colossians 3. Colossians 3. That's in the New Testament. And verses 12 to 13. I think I need to just check that I've got all these right, don't I? It is right. Okay. Who'd like to read that? Who's gone to Colossians 3? Oh, Stan. Oh, these new members are very keen, aren't they? Come on, Dave.
I'll do the next one.
12 to 13.
Since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourself a tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults, and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others.
Thanks, Stan. And then the third one, this is just a verse, 1 Peter 5:5. 1 Peter 5, chapter 5, verse 5. I think Dave is going to do this. He feels the pressure.
Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another. For God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble.
Brilliant. And then just one more. I think we'll come over this side, so just get ready on this side. Anybody feel brave? James. Again, that's in the New Testament, if you don't know where James is. Chapter 4 and verse 10. Grace, thank you.
Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you.
Great. So, 4 different verses, and I'm going to read one final little passage, which is a little bit longer, but it's sort of a key passage really in this context. So Philippians chapter 2. I'm going to read a few verses from verse 1. So it says, if, this is Paul writing, he says, if then there is any encouragement in Christ, if any consolation of love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, make my joy complete by thinking the same way, having the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Now everyone should look not only to their own interests, but rather to the interests of others. Adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Instead, he emptied himself. By assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity, he became as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. So for this reason, God has highly exalted him, giving him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I wonder whether you've got any idea what I'm going to talk about from reading some of those verses this morning. What timeless virtue, which is such a significant characteristic around this idea of how we belong together. How do we belong together in a local church community? And part of our desire in this theme is to sort of be really practical together. It's wonderful, isn't it, to have those thoughts about how we're a living temple, we're part of the church, and God's church is global, and God's church is national. But how do you work that out locally with people who sometimes will annoy you? Let's be honest. And I think to do that, we need this characteristic. We need to really focus in on this virtue, and that is humility. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about humility. I want to define it and give you a bit of a foundation. I want to talk about some of the characteristics that make up this word humility. And then I want to give you some practical applications and scenarios in a local church where I think humility can really help us rub along and get along well. I'm not going to say who that was. I'll be humble about it. So, Philippians, wow, what a passage, eh? Philippians 2. If there's one passage in the New Testament that you might consider memorizing, it would be Philippians 2. It's such a powerful reminder of how important this humility is, and it points us so well to Jesus, doesn't it? We're given this amazing example, this amazing person who humbled himself, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. We could just stay there for a while and think about it, couldn't we? This Jesus, this man. But that's not what we're about this morning. We're about this idea that we don't look to our own interests, but look to the interests of others. So if you want a definition of humility, I think defined in this passage in particular, I think this is the definition. It's the act of selflessly considering others before ourselves. The act of selflessly considering others before ourselves. I think it's Rick Warren who said this, and so I'm quoting him. His definition of humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Which I think is quite a good little play. Because sometimes we get a bit confused about humility, and we think humility is about being a doormat, or but it's this idea, isn't it? Not thinking less of yourself, because actually, Our identity and our status is as priests and royalty and sons and daughters of God. So we have a high regard and view of our identity. If you're a Christian, if you follow Jesus, if you've accepted him into your life, you're seeking to live that out day by day, then your identity is royal. So don't think less of yourself, but in that moment, perhaps think of yourself less. That's humility. So what does that look like in terms of some of the ways in Scripture? Well, some of these characteristics, and I'll run through these quite quickly, and I'll give you some references. So I think the first one is servanthood. Again, Jesus typifies this so much. Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. So that characteristic of servanthood. And in a life of a church like this, there are those that just rise up, I think, as the gold dust of any church. And those are the people who serve, who just do things sometimes without even being asked to do it, who actually aren't on the rota for that particular week or particular task. And they come along and they realize, oh, that still needs to be done. Servanthood, that ability to serve others. Secondly, gentleness, I think, is a good characteristic. This is a great passage. We read it, didn't we? Colossians 3. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Again, gentleness can be one of those characteristics that feels like it's weakness, but it's not, is it? I think gentleness is actually really strong. And that's the way that we interact with each other, with a gentleness in our hearts and spirit. Thirdly, I think humility, a characteristic is this recognition that we have a complete dependency on God. And again, this is one of those things that we butt up against in terms of how we relate to our non-Christian friends and to the society and culture that we live in, where actually most of our culture says, I can do this on my own. I do not need anybody else to define who I am. I define myself. Humility comes in an opposite spirit, and James 4:10 talks about humble yourselves and he will lift you up. Again, I think if we come into any context of church, and I keep coming back to this again and again, that we have to acknowledge our dependency on God's grace and seek that guidance in all aspects of our church life. And then fourthly, this sense of being unified in humility, God's favor on the humble. We read it again, 1 Peter 5:5. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. I think one of the things that we need to understand and dig into as individuals is that God's favor rests upon the humble. If we're seeking for God's favor to be on our lives in ever increasing ways, then one of the ways that God is attracted to us is humility. And I think if we as a church family, as we as a group who are together at Hull Baptist Church, collectively want to see God's favor on us, and I think we do. We want to see God's favor working in us and through us. Then an atmosphere of humility will be one of those key attributes. And then finally, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Clothe yourself with humility. And I think this again, we picked it up in 1 Peter 5:5, where it says, clothe yourselves. I don't know if you've ever thought through that. Like this morning, probably without really thinking about it, we all clothed ourselves, thankfully, before we came to church. Maybe some of us took a little bit of time in the wardrobe thinking, what shall I wear this morning? I was like, shall I wear a shirt this morning? Shall I wear a jumper? So I went for a jumper. But maybe you just threw on what was there, next to your bed and like, I'm already late. I'm just going to throw everything on that I've got. I don't know whether you've thought about what you've clothed yourself with. There used to be a time, I'm not saying it was right and we should go back to this, where people would put on their Sunday best to go to church. So they really, I'm not saying we should be doing that. Don't think next week or not, next time we gather, should we come on our Sunday? We did it once. You remember we had an Easter Sunday in lockdown and we all decided to dress up as if, that was quite fun, wasn't it? So it's good to do it from time to time. But do you think about clothing yourself with humility? Or clothing yourself with these characteristics to take time at the beginning of your day? And this is part of that habit, isn't it? If you find time, and I know it's not always easy to do this in the midst of our lives, but to take some time at the start of the day just to clothe yourself. Maybe even as you're putting your clothes on physically, why not clothe yourself spiritually? Why not think about humility or patience or kindness? I'm going to clothe myself today with kindness. I'm going to go into my day and into my workplace and into those people that I interact with, clothed in kindness. Clothed with humility. So those are just 5 little characteristics. Say little, they're big, aren't they, really, to be honest? But what I want to then just think about is like if we are sort of highlighting the importance of of humility and then what humility looks like. It looks like servanthood, it looks like gentleness, it looks like being unified in that humility. And then what scenarios work themselves out in the local church? How does that work itself out? Well, let me give you 5 examples where we can begin to apply this in our local church, in this local church. First one is to express our unity by accepting our diversity. So unity in diversity is how I would express it. Romans 12 verse 16 says this: live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. It's one of those challenges, isn't it, within the life of a church, that you end up spending time being in context, meeting people that aren't like you. And that's good, but it's also difficult. Like I said before, like if people are different than you, they're going to think differently, they're going to look differently, they're going to behave slightly differently. How do we express our unity then when people are different from us? Well, we do it by coming in this spirit of humility. So my encouragement to us is to embrace the diversity, and let's be praying for more diversity, shall we? How do we make and develop this diversity? How do we work together when we're so different? Well, one of the ways is to recognize that every one of us in this room, because of our difference, because of the way that God has wired us and made us, that means we all have a unique contribution to this local church. And that is so enriching, isn't it? It's so enriching that we all can bring something of who we are and what God has gifted us in our personality. And bring it and share it and serve with it. So let's think, how does that work itself out? Secondly, and I guess this builds on the idea that we are a diverse group of people, I think humility is really helpful when we get into some conflict. Oh my goodness. I hate conflict. It's not that good to be a church leader and don't like conflict, because it ends up cropping up quite a few times in my life. And nobody likes conflict. But actually, if we're going to do church well, and we do disagree on some things, then how do we disagree agreeably? In a world that does not know how to disagree agreeably, let's be honest. Particularly if you live in the world of social media, where if you say anything that somebody doesn't agree with you, you're just cancelled out. And it's easy even in a church to sometimes do that. Like, well, if that person doesn't agree with that, I'm just going to cancel. I'm not going to spend any time with them. I'm not going to. But we need to find ways. And I don't know if you, we might put this in the Friday email, actually. A friend of mine, a guy called Ken Benjamin. Some of you will remember Ken. Ken was president of the Baptist Union a few years ago. And when he was president, he came and spoke at Hull Baptist Church. It was when we were at the Methodist Church one afternoon, just out of lockdown time. He's just done literally a 5-minute video on how to disagree agreeably. And we'll put it in the Friday email so you can have a look at it. It's such a really helpful summary of how do you do that. And he was talking particularly, not just about a local church, but he was talking about the wider church. And he was talking about denominations and different ways that we have disagreements. You know, Ephesians 4, again, one of those verses, it's just very similar to Colossians 3. Be completely humble and gentle, bear with one another in love, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. So when we have conflict, when we have a disagreement, in those moments, clothe yourself with humility before you go and have the conversation, before you begin to address the conflict. If we just clothe ourselves with humility and the idea that we're going to preserve the unity of the church. Danny Silk, some of you will know that name, one of the pastors out of Bethel Church, writes a lot around relationships and relationship conflict. And he says that one of the goals of conflict resolution is not agreement, but connection. Are we willing to stay connected with people, even though we might disagree with them? And again, that's something to process and think through, because we're people of conviction, Christians. And when you have convictions, you can become a little bit of a pain in the neck to people who need to know your convictions. And yeah, I won't go there. I was just thinking politically, but I won't. I'm going to stop. Let's move on. Third way that we can apply humility is what I call financial generosity. So in a local church, our humility is expressed in this approach to financial generosity. Again, just going back to the Philippians passage. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, consider others as more important than yourselves. I guess one of the best ways to reflect on how much you think other people are more important than you is how you spend your money. Let's be honest. You know, we all need to spend money, and we all like to spend money on ourselves. And that's not wrong, per se. But in that context of humility and with thinking of others, then there's going to be those moments, aren't there, where we think about how do we use this resource that we have of money to then use that money to bless and to help others who are less fortunate, when we're thinking of people who are, more importantly than thinking about ourselves. So I think humility guides our actions. And again, many of us in this room have this principle. We maybe don't think it through. But this is what's guarding us, isn't it? It's like if we have that heart of humility, I think it naturally lends us to have a generous spirit. We consider the needs and the well-being of others around us. And that's part of what we are as a church family. So I just take this opportunity to tell you, and some of you might know this, but all the income that comes into Hull Baptist Church that enables us to do all the expenditure that we do as Hull Baptist Church comes from you. 95% of the money comes from you. It doesn't come from any structure, Baptist structure, hierarchical structure that says, oh, we'll give Hull Baptist Church a few £1,000s. We do apply for grants, and by God's grace, we are successful at times in getting grants. But the mainstay of what we do as a church is through your generosity. And it enables us, and we are very blessed as a church, that we can then invest in people. We have a whole load of people who work for Hull Baptist Church. We have buildings and tools that we invest in and we resource and we use on a weekly basis to enable us to do what we do. We give away nearly 15% of what we are given as a church. We give that away to mission and to those people who are less fortunate than us, particularly overseas mission. We give that away and support ministries and people and individuals who are working in another context, in another situation, or in another part of our city. We also invest in some things that are in Chester that we believe in. So all of this stuff comes out of this spirit of humility and generosity. And I just encourage you to keep thinking about that. Think about how does that work itself out in just this desire to be financially generous. And I guess that's part of our faith journey as well, particularly when everything around us, and I get it, I live in the real world as well. My gas bill's just gone up quite a lot, actually, because we were on a fixed-term contract. And I'm sure others, mortgages, all these fixed-term, so it's cost of living crisis, it's real. But there's also that dynamic, isn't there, that God is the one we trust in for finance. And Jesus did say, and we need to work this out together, be more blessed to give than to receive. That's the third one. Fourthly, submission to authority. This is an interesting one, isn't it? Again, in terms of how a church structures, so again, the 1 Peter 5:5, in the same way you are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. There's this sense of working that out in a local church. We as a church don't use the title of elder as a church. I don't know if some of you have been around churches maybe before, and the way churches are structured can be structured in all sorts of ways, all sorts of titles, all sorts of roles. Some of you know that Sue and I have been around HBC for quite a long time, and we've had all sorts of alliterations of leaders. Is that the right word, Ruth? Iterations. Thank you very much. So we've had elders, deacons, we've had all sorts of different ways, but right now we have a leadership team. And that leadership team includes those of us who are ministers of this church, but also others who make up that team. And there's that sense, isn't there? If you're in a local church, what's your relationship to the leadership of that local church? I guess one of the reasons you may join Hull Baptist Church when you're looking for a church or praying about belonging is, well, what's the leadership like? What do they hold on some key doctrinal views? Might be really important to you. But how do you express that submission and respecting of leaders? I guess some of that is that humility goes towards those of us who seek to guide and shepherd this church, have that responsibility to do that together. If we're all coming at it clothed with humility, then there'll be those moments where, maybe there is some disagreement. I don't always expect you to agree with me or agree with us as a leadership team on things. But what I really hope you will do is that you will respect and support what we feel God is asking us to do as a church. And in a Baptist church, there's an opportunity to be quite collaborative in that. That's one of the reasons why we have church family gatherings. It's why we seek the mind of Christ together. It's why we encourage the prophetic hearing God together culture, because actually we all can hear from God. We can all discern together, but some of us, by God's grace, have been given the role and responsibility of leadership. And I guess the flip side is the final thing I'll talk about, which is, it connects, but it's that idea of mutual submission. So Ephesians 5:21 says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So in some senses, yes, there is that place of submitting to those in authority, or even submitting in terms of, sometimes people who are older than you might have a little bit more wisdom than you if you're a younger person. So sometimes it makes good sense to listen to an older person's perspective on something, and you submit and you listen. But this verse extends that principle and says it goes beyond age or position. It says, let's submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This mutual submission creates an environment where humility flourishes. And I think it allows the grace of God to abound across us as a church. The grace of God is that means by which we see one another, we hear one another through the grace. And so we, in our day and age, we have so many little sort of memes or sayings, don't we? It's okay not to be okay. That's a good phrase, and we need to understand that. Everybody you meet has a story going on behind their lives, so don't just judge a book by its cover. We get that, but in a church context, there's not many places, I don't think, where you get such a collective of people from all sorts of backgrounds and situations and circumstances where we try to become one body. But if that submission, if that grace of God is going through us, even when we meet somebody for the first time, or we come across somebody who maybe their life is in a moment of struggle, and let's be honest, we all go round that circle. So it's not like we have this group of people over here who are the strong people, and we have this group of people over here who are the weak people, and the strong people are always helping the weak people. That's not the story of church, is it? It's a circle of stuff that sometimes you're in a place where you are in a weak place and you need somebody who's stronger to support you. But that goes round. And you might be in a season where you're feeling really strong. You're looking out for the weak. You might be in a place where you are feeling very weak right now. And that's okay, because there'll be some strong people around you. So that's the grace of God abounding, moving amongst us as we relate and as we talk and as we help one another. So in conclusion, let's just reflect a little bit on the richness of humility in God's word. To me, it links a little bit with that sort of sense of authenticness. People can smell when people are being what's the word? Not authentic. Whether they're sort of pretending a little bit. And all of us can do it. We have to be so careful we don't pretend this Christianity. Because there is a gap in our lives, if we're honest, between what we believe and sometimes how we live. Let's be honest. But we don't want to pretend that we're something that we're not. Let's be real about who we are. That's the humility, isn't it, of the grace of God sustaining and protecting and moving us forward. Let's commit ourselves to serve, to be gentle, to recognize our dependency on God, and to foster this community that reflects the love of Christ. And this is my prayer for us as I close. May the spirit of humility be our guide, shaping the very fabric of our local church as we journey together in faith. That's part of what it means to belong.